Today, I'm speaking with the Chinese-American political commentator, journalist, and podcast host, Carl Zha. Now, for those of you who've never come across Carl before, he was born in China shortly after the death of Mao Zedong and personally experienced the rapid transformation from poverty to prosperity, and eventually moved to the United States, where he gained his citizenship, but also an education in electrical engineering. Eventually, however, he transitioned into media, where he spent much of his time challenging many of the Western narratives, the propaganda narratives about China. He's currently based in Bali, Indonesia, where he hosts the very popular geopolitical podcast, Silk and Steel. Carl, it's a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you for inviting me.
So, Carl, I wanted to speak to you and get your perspective on the 12-day Iran-Israel war. By this time now, it's been a month, so we have a pretty clear picture of how Israel was able to carry out their attacks, what Iran's weak points were, what their strong points were. Obviously, we know that Iran visited both Russia and China for a conference, and there was potential discussions about soliciting new equipment. So I wanted to hear from you and get your assessment. What did you make of the war, and what do you think Iran needs to do next in order to secure their position in the region?
Well, first of all, Israel bite a little bit more than they could chew. I mean, Netanyahu has a vested interest in expanding aggression against country all throughout the region because, for one, he needed to stay out of jail. Otherwise, he will be in jail on corruption charges. So he needs to be the wartime president. And this is why he expanded Israeli operation against Gaza, but also aggression against Lebanon and Iran. And however, for the Israeli strike against Iran to work, he needed to loop in United States because Israel on its own is not sufficient to take on Iran, a regional power. This is why Netanyahu has been traveling to Washington. The Israeli lobby had a very intense lobbying effort to drag United States into a Middle Eastern war. And we saw that Iran could handle Israel easily on its own because Iran has tens of thousands of missiles. This is the first time, Israeli have suffered consequences, real consequences of their aggression. They can no longer be the aggressor with impunity. Tel Aviv, we saw the missile that turned off the lights, switch off the lights in Haifa. We saw Tel Aviv getting bombarded with missiles, and Iran can just keep this going. This is why, despite Israel have probably the world's most advanced missile shield system, not just Israel, but also United States, the entire NATO, they park their missile shield system all around the region in order to intercept incoming Iranian missiles. Yet those Iranian missiles still find their targets. This is why Israel sued for peace, for ceasefire, because they know they couldn't continue at this pace. For one thing, their economy is nearly collapsing, not least because they were committing a genocide in Gaza, but also they cannot sustain a normal life under constant missile barrages. And a lot of the Israeli settlers, contrary to what they claim, they have places to go. Many of them have multiple passports, and many of them are getting the heck out. And you cannot maintain a settler colony without settlers. This is why they had to call a pause. And from Iran's side, there was a popular Chinese internet meme. In China, a lot of people also monitoring this conflict. And the popular internet meme in China is that Iran has a very strong spear, but they need a stronger shield because what we saw was Israeli air superiority. That meant the Israeli F-35, Israeli F-16s were able to launch missiles against the western part of Iran, where many of the Iranian missile launchers were located. Now, one biggest advantage that Iran has is position of tens of thousands of missiles. But if their missile launching is getting interrupted by Israeli airstrike, obviously that's not ideal. And they needed to upgrade their air defense system so their missile launcher will be protected and will pose a strong deterrent against future Israeli aggression. So I think within this context, it actually makes sense for Iran to approach China to purchase air defense systems because China can very quickly provide those because there's no supply side bottleneck. Because according to Western media, China has an overcapacity issue. The Chinese factories can roll out these air defense missiles in no time flat. and they can very quickly help Iran bolster their air defense. And so, in essence, bolstering their own deterrent against Israel, because then the real deterrent Iran have against Israel it's their missiles, and there's those missile launchers needs to be protected. This is my 2 cents.
I want to ask you 2 questions about what you've said. Firstly, you mentioned that Benjamin Netanyahu needed to expand this war in order to avoid being charged with corruption and potentially facing jail time. I've heard this argument made for 2 years. I don't know how I feel about it. The reason why is because, one, while this is definitely, there's an element of Netanyahu, this being his war or his genocide, this is still Israel's strategic interest, right? We know that they want to ethnically cleanse Gaza, eventually the West Bank, and we know that they do see Iran as an enemy, regardless of whether Netanyahu's in that position or not. So are you suggesting that this is purely because of Netanyahu, or do you think it's a mix of the two, that this isn't Israel's interest, but also...
No. I mean, this is this whole Israeli committing genocide in Gaza. This is a whole Israeli whole society operation. This is not just Netanyahu's operation. It's just so that Netanyahu's interest coincides with because he needs this for himself, and he exasperated the situation. But Israel has always seen Iran as an obstacle to its regional dominance. I mean, we saw there was a talk by General Wesley Clark, the former spring commander of NATO. This was I think a decade ago. He said right after 9/11, he was talking to his buddies inside Pentagon, and they say, "Oh yeah, we have a plan for taking out 7 countries in 5 years." And if you look at the list of the countries, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Sudan,
Somalia, Lebanon, I think, yeah.
Somalia, Lebanon, and Iran. Iran was the last one on the list, and so Iran has always been the target. But again, Israel alone cannot take on Iran. This is why they really want drag United States into the war. Whereas after the whole Iraq deal, the idea of getting involving another Middle Eastern war is deeply unpopular in the United States. You would know that you live in the U.S. right now, and nobody wants to die for Israel. And so what Trump did is he tried to thread the needle. He said, "Okay, I'm gonna do my thing, stand by Israel." Well, I mean, I think Trump is. I think he would have gone for a easy Israeli victory if that was possible. This is why the Israeli strike on Iran nuclear facility, from the beginning, it wasn't just a purely Israeli strike. It was a joint U.S.-Israeli strike, because U.S. provided satellite intelligence and refueling capability, because Israel Air Force lacks the F-35 cannot make to Iran and back without refueling. And the Israeli Air Force lacks the refueling capability on their own. They needed United States to help them refuel in air. And we also saw during the Iranian retaliation, you have all these U.S. vassal states in the region, like Jordan, scrambling their air force and air defense, trying to intercept the Iranian missiles. So this is a joint U.S.-Israeli effort. But I think Trump would prefer to a easy, quick victory. When he saw that wasn't possible, he wasn't going to risk his presidency to launch a ground invasion of Iran, for example, because that's what would be needed for a regime change. What we saw is the aerial attack is not going to cause regime collapse in Iran, because Iranian people are very patriotic people. They actually rally around the flag. You saw Iranians from all walks of life have emerged and saying, we need to defend ourselves. We need nukes, right? So without a massive ground invasion, there's no way they can accomplish their true objective, which is regime change in Iran. But the United States is not ready for that. So this is why Trump did this intentional glancing blow, a symbolic strike on Iranian nuclear facilities, so he can't say to Netanyahu and his all these Israeli lobby people, "Oh, I did it. I stood by Israel. I destroyed Iran's nuclear facility, and then now give me a Nobel Peace Prize now. I mean that's his whole gambit, right?
Yeah.
And it's Trump is unpredictable. He's so predictable in so many ways, and so here we are. Israel realized they could not go on waging this war alone against Iran. That's why they had to sue for ceasefire. But this is, keep in mind, this is a ceasefire. This is not a peace deal, which means this hostility can resume at any time. In fact, Netanyahu was just in Washington, no doubt, asking United States to back for another future Israeli strike. He asked for U.S. support for a preemptive Israeli strike in the future, and this is why both sides right now are taking this pause in hostility to build up their own capabilities. For Israel side, is trying to get resupply from United States, and for Iran, this is why we saw their approachment with China to get the air to get the air defense systems.
What exactly could China provide that Iran was lacking? Because Iran has air defenses that they've been very proud of, but they fell short for a multitude of reasons. We know obviously there were internal espionage attacks, and then Israel had a combination of flying through northwestern territory to get to Azerbaijan, loop around, fire standoff missiles. We haven't seen any video evidence of Israeli fighter jets over Iran's airspace, but we know that they did get over their airspace. So it's not like they were flying deep into Iran at will, but they did still establish the same thing. Regardless, they were still flying all, projectiles, drones, firing standoff missiles. So what would China provide? Is it more layers of air defense? Can you comment on this? Do you have any knowledge about what specifically China could do to help Iran bolster the air defenses other than just swapping systems?
Well, actually, so Iran has for a long time, for variety of reasons, they try to rely on indigenous capabilities, because Iranians are very proud people. They see themselves as inheritor of the great Persian civilization. Independence and sovereignty is very important for them. This is why they kick out the Americans in 1979 in the first place. They don't want to have to rely on outside power for their own national defense, and they always stress on indigenization, and also people need to keep in mind there was an international arms embargo on Iran until October 2020. So it was only lifted very recently, and Iran did try to procure the air defense system from Russia. There was deal signed for S-300, S-400, and as well as Su-35 fighter jet. But all these new defense system, it takes time to set up, and it takes training. You need to send your ground crews and your pilots, for example, over to train first before you receive the jets and the air defense system, so you know how to operate them. So all those things took time, and what it looks like it was Israel in cahoots with United States. They used a nuclear negotiation as a ruse to lull Iranian leadership into a false sense of security, and this allowed them to do this sneak strike. Israeli admitted it themselves. They said, "Oh, we did to them like a Pearl Harbor and 9/11 in one." I'm like, okay, did you just compare yourself to Pearl Harbor and 9/11? This comes straight. That came straight from the horse's mouth, and so they had the element of surprise, and they also have apparently now we know they're heavily infiltrated Iran, but I do think they kind of blow their wad in the first few days, because they activated all their Mossad assets, who are now being cleaned, being ferried out and cleansed out of Iran right now. And they thought they were able to do a decapitation strike, particularly against Iranian top leadership, right? But the problem is, Iran is a country with 95 million people. It has boundless human capitals. It's not you can't. Iran has no problem replacing its leadership. even if this is a big blow against Iran, in terms of prestige, and but what we saw was in terms of Iranian reaction, they launched their missile strike against Israel without a hitch. That means they already developed a contingency plan way beforehand. This is what we will do if Israel strike us, and they follow the plan to a T, and everything worked out. So this tells me so the so-called decapitation strike against Iranian leadership will mean very little, because Iran, they can easily replace their leadership, and their system will continue to function. As what what we did saw was there was obviously some limitation to the Iranian air defense, right? Because they had to, as the war went on, Iran had to rely more on their missiles from the eastern side of the country, where Israeli couldn't reach. Whereas the western side of Iran, where actually Iran has some more advanced missiles, there were less launched from those regions, possibly because of the Israeli threat. And Israel, they were launching airstrike from within the airspace of like Syria, probably Jordan or Azerbaijan, because Israel is very close ally with Azerbaijan. So Iran needed desperately to shore up their defense, especially on their western border, to make sure there's not any kind of vulnerability any kind of hole gets plugged. And this is where China can provide a very quick solution, like some may even call it stopgap measures. This because these are some serious holes in the Iranian air defense that needs to be plugged. And it just so happened that Chinese defense system can very quickly give them the capability to have the defense capability they didn't have before. This most importantly to protect those missile launching sites on the western side of Iran.
So, can you explain to my audience what the relationship is like between China and Iran? On X, obviously, people were very emotional, angry, panicking, and they were like, why isn't China and Russia doing more? And I saw people saying, well, the Chinese and Russian position is Iran is doing just fine. It's not as bad as you think. But let's say Iran were in a sensitive position. Is Iran so important to China and Russia, but let's focus on China, I guess, that China would potentially not get involved militarily, but step up and provide them with whatever they need?
Well, first of all, I understand why people became very emotional, because Iran is one of the regional power that was actually been doing anything about Israel, right? Because they supported Hamas, they supported Hezbollah, they supported Ansar Allah in Yemen, and now they saw that this is what they get for their support. This is why they're being targeted by Israel. But from Iran on its own can handle Israel. Israel cannot cause an existential problem for Iran. Just the size problem, the capability. What would tip the balance really is we're talking about U.S. direct intervention if in case of a U.S. war against Iran, but that hasn't happened yet. So there's on one hand, Iran did not ask for help from Russia and China because they knew they could handle it, and if U.S. do get involved directly, that's a whole different equation, and I'm sure in that case, Russia and China would back up Iran, whatever they need, because neither China or Russia wants Iran to fail. This is right now, U.S. is essentially waging a three-front war. They have a proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. They through their own proxy in Israel, they're trying to destabilize the Middle East, and then they also try to contain China in the Western Pacific. So any one of these pillars falls, that just means the U.S. will be able to shift its resources to confront the remaining two. I mean, this is U.S. has made no secret what they want to do. They want to pivot to Asia. There's a significant a poor faction in the U.S. national security establishment. They keep on talking about this. They say, okay, we got to wrap up our fight in Ukraine. We got to extricate ourselves from Middle East so we can concentrate our resources to do this one real big civilization war against China in the Western Pacific, right? So it's neither in Russia or China's interest to see Iran fall. And this is why, you know, Iran was under U.S. and European sanction for a very long time, particularly a sanction on its lifeline, the oil and gas sales. China currently purchases more than 89% of Iranian oil precisely because China do not want Iran to fail. I mean, this is an economic lifeline to Iran, and to sustain the Iranian economy. This is how the sanction is designed to work. It's designed to cause regime collapse by causing economic collapse. And for the same reason, China do not want Russia to fail in Europe. It does not want to see Iran to fail in the Middle East, because they know if that happens, all resources of U.S. military industrial complex then will be concentrated on China. China is the last big juicy target, and China and Iran itself has a long friendly relationship. You know, in like even in the modern times. I'm not even saying like stretch back to the ancient Sasanian time. That's true too. But even in the modern times, you know, China and Iran have maintained a friendly relationship. But what's keep in mind is a relationship between Russia, China, Iran. This triangle is not the same as a NATO alliance. NATO alliance is a military alliance that's headed by Washington, that's subservient to Washington's interests. Whereas Iran, Russia, China, they're all sovereign countries, right? They have their own forum to discuss defense cooperation. For example, they're all members of Shanghai Cooperation Forum, right? But it's a forum. It's not a military alliance. So the nature of the relationship is different. But at the same time, you know, geopolitically, neither Russia or China wants Iran to fail. So I think people are just kind of panicking a little bit when they saw it looks like Israel was going to drag Donald Trump into wage full-on war against Iran, but that did not happen, right? I mean, this is Iran can handle Israel. We know what Iran's capabilities are right now. What we're going to probably see is both China and Russia will supply. They will have now even a tighter security arrangement, because people need to remember a weapon sale is not just hardware exchanging hands. You like for a weapon system, you need maintenance, you need training. There will be exchange of personnel. So this is a decade-long relationship building exercise. And so the weapon sales from China to Iran or from Russia to Iran, that will necessitate a tighter integration between these countries' national security establishment.
So until that tighter integration happens, based on what you described, it sounds like China, Russia, and Iran kind of have a decentralized alliance where everyone can act according to their own interests, but they have a vested interest in one another, and there's strength to that. But that lacks a form of centralization that NATO has, right? And so do you think that's a flaw? Like, how do you view that comparing to NATO and all the support that Israel gets? And do you think that could potentially lead to a loss?
Right. I mean, this is people need to understand what multipolarity is. You know, multipolarity is not the flip side of NATO. We're not talking about like the Cold War where you have a Soviet bloc versus the Western bloc, right? So the whole idea of multipolarity is that every country's independent sovereignty should be respected. If you look at the BRICS, right? A lot of people look at the BRICS as alliance, even though BRICS originally started as a marketing acronym by Goldman Sachs to sell stocks in the emerging market. It just so happened now it's an economic forum. It's to emphasize BRICS is an economic forum. Look at the countries in the BRICS. You have both China and India, whose interests might sometimes do not align. But the whole point of BRICS is all these countries can maintain their differences and they can maintain their independence and sovereignty. They're not answerable to one overlord the way the NATO answers to Washington. That is the world they're trying to build here. They're not trying to have a unipolar world where everybody must bend the knee to their master in Washington. They want to have a world where each country can pursue their own strategic interests. So there's a fundamental difference in the natures of BRICS and the NATO, and even the Shanghai Cooperation Forum and NATO. But given the recent development, we will see an even tighter integration and tighter cooperation between Russia, China, and Iran. And this is simply due to the pressure the NATO alliance is putting on them right now.
Very interesting. So I want to there was a question specifically I wanted to ask. I'll have to come back to it because you said so much. It's like everything you say just unlocks 3 or 4 other questions. But okay. So you said that China imports they purchase 89% of Iran's oil exports. So Iran is 100% dependent on China. Where do the majority of these oil exports come from? Do they go through the Strait of Hormuz, through the Persian Gulf, or are they going overland on this new railroad that has been advanced? Where is this oil coming from? And the reason why I'm asking is because one very powerful deterrent Iran has is threatening the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. But if that's going to hurt the country that they export 89% of their oil to, then that kind of removes that ability to enact that deterrent. Am I understanding that correctly? What exactly do we need to understand about this?
Well, okay, so people have to understand the water transport beats land transport, just in terms of the cost, because the rail is great, but it cannot compare in terms of cost of ocean transport. So majority of the oil export from Iran still goes through the Strait of Hormuz. They still go through Strait of Malacca up South China Sea to China. This is why United States Navy keep on talking about choking points when they talk about containing China. They keep on talking about how the Strait of Malacca is a potential choking point. If a war breaks out, that can choke off energy supply to China. And this is also China's Belt and Road Initiative project. One of the goals is to build many connection points, so there's not one choking point. This is why China is building a port in Pakistan, the Gwadar port, which sits right near the mouth of Persian Gulf. And the idea is in the future they might build a pipeline that connects Gwadar all the way to Western China, so the ship don't have to travel to Strait of Malacca and up South China Sea. And that including the rail link, they just recently updated the rail link to Iran. Now, currently, most of the oil is still carried by tankers. In fact, these are carried by the so-called shadow fleet, which is because they don't want to get sanctioned by U.S. People need to understand the U.S. EU sanction is essentially amount to a global sanction, because how U.S. sanction works is they will, if you have any kind of financial dealing in the United States, or you have any kind of financial dealing using U.S. dollars, that means the U.S. government is going to sanction you. And this is what Trump meant when he put secondary sanction on Iran and Venezuela. That means any company that does business with Iran or purchasing Iranian oil will be liable to U.S. sanction. And And so these shadow fleet that will carry the Iranian oil to Southeast Asia, and a lot of them get unloaded, swap tankers, they get relabeled as Indonesian or Malaysian oil, and then they get shipped over to these private oil refineries in China, mostly located in Shandong province. Now, these private independent oil refiners, they're called teacup refineries. They're willing to take the risk of getting U.S. sanctioned because they're small operations. All their market is China. They sell to Chinese customers. They don't have overseas exposures, so they deal in Chinese yuan only. They don't have U.S. They don't have to deal with foreign currency exchange. They don't have to use U.S. dollar. So even if they get U.S. sanctioned by U.S. government, they won't be impacted as much. Whereas they were getting these Iranian oil at 15% discount, and that's enough margin for them to risk the sanctions. And so this is what's happening, and I kind of lost my train of thought. Well,
Yeah.
So
the Strait of Hormuz and the deterrent and
right. So, but China still right now there is majority of these shipping still goes through Strait of Hormuz, obviously, and goes through Strait of Malacca, and those are the choking points that U.S. Navy constantly talking about. So I think closing down Strait of Hormuz is a big deal because that won't just affect the Iranian oil. That affects all the oil from the Gulf region, right? Like all that will impact all the other oil-producing countries like UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, everybody, and including everyone who imports from that region. I think so. I don't know if that's. I mean, that's definitely one card Iran could play, but I think that would be like the last resort, right? That would be the last resort because this have potentially more far-reaching impact. Oil can be carried on rail, but that will be limited by the rail capacity, and it's unless they build a pipeline. If they build a pipeline, that will change the whole equation. But that's a multi-billion-dollar investment, and that's probably not in the cards anytime soon. But yeah, that oil pipeline will more than any kind of rail link will actually solve that problem of Strait of Hormuz issue. But at present we're that because it takes like 10 years to build an oil pipeline, through Central Asia and to China and etc.
I was in Iran early May, so a little more than a month prior to the attack, and I was staying at this hotel, and there were Russian and Chinese people there, and at breakfast I would strike up conversations with them. And I asked them, like, what are you guys doing here? And they said, we're here for a conference, oil and gas. And, the Russian guy had a drilling company. The Chinese guy he was representing a company that was going to sell this new piece of equipment that would make Iranian drilling much more efficient and reduce, like, it has less maintenance, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, I mean, you can see that, there's clearly an economic alliance, taking place, and it's represented by these business people from Russia and China. But that is concerning that, Iran's one deterrent, right, would potentially hurt China. But it sounds like it would just hurt everyone. And that's why it's just a final resort. And so the hope is that it never gets to that point. But it's not like, I think the misunderstanding people have is they think it'll hurt China more than America, where I think it will hurt everyone if they were to actually.
It will hurt everyone. Yeah. Because what happened is oil is a fungible commodity, right? Like if the oil gets cut off from that region, people will have to purchase oil from elsewhere. It would just raise up the price of oil for everybody. So like you can still get oil in the United States. The price will still shot up like 3-4 times because people are probably gonna the same place you're getting those oil. somebody will try to export it to elsewhere, to China or Europe for higher price. Like all the Canadian oil probably going to go to China, if they get a better deal over there. So shutting down the Strait of Hormuz will raise the price of oil for everybody in the world, essentially.
So you mentioned that there's this very interesting chain of like unofficial, like they're just trying to get around the sanctions. So you mentioned tankers swapping hands, moving, the oil from this ship to that ship. Eventually, it's like acquired by Indonesia or Malaysia, and then eventually these private refineries in China. Is it possible for the U.S. to sanction all along that chain and eventually
Well,
get?
this is so right now, this is very decentralized network, which makes sanction harder because for U.S. sanction to work, they need to know who to sanction. They need a list, right? The whole point of these shadow fleet is they're not insured by by the insurers in London. So this is why it's harder for them to track. This is why they sometimes offload their oil to another tankers, and this is all to make tracking more difficult. And the decentralized nature, it means it just takes so much resources to track each individual tankers and each individual operations. And this is
I'm assuming if they
United
did sanction them, they would pivot and switch and shuffle everything.
Exactly. I mean, U.S. is powerful, but not that powerful. They can't possibly monitor everything. They have limited resources, right? They can't target big companies. For example, they did go after Huawei for, building telecom infrastructure in Iran, because Huawei had some business back then in the United States. That's why they got Canada to detain Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou, ostensibly for sanction busting against Iran, right? That's how the U.S. sanction works. They can go after anybody who have any kind of business with United States or any dealing with U.S. dollars. This is why the Brazilian president Lula recently in the BRICS summit, he said there's a desperate need for new trade currency. He didn't name U.S. dollars specifically, but he said we need to have a new trade currency. Otherwise, we'll end the 21st century the same way we started 20th century. Which, if people know what happened the first starting of 20th century, you have two world war, right? And of course, Trump took umbrage to that and said, "Oh, BRICS is an anti-American alliance. How dare they try to move off the U.S. dollar?" Even though Lula said nothing about U.S. dollar explicitly in his talk, and this is why he's slapping 50% tariff on Brazil right now. But
which only encourages and bolsters his point. So
exactly, because Brazil currently, there's actually the U.S. actually enjoy a small surplus in their trade with Brazil, and the trade between U.S. and Brazil actually is dwarfed by the trade between Brazil and China and other BRICS nations. So this is just going to push Brazil even further towards the direction of BRICS.
So, in your view, how would you describe China's role? China really does seem like the leader of this multipolar world. And I don't mean to discredit or disrespect any of the other actors, right? But China, because of its sheer size, its weight, its economic power, the factories, decades of like stable leadership moving in, one clear direction, just prioritizing China's interests, serving the people, uplifting the people, and advancing their capabilities. So how is China viewed by the other members? And how does China view itself in this multipolar project?
Yeah, I mean, one thing people need to keep in mind is China's non-interference foreign policy. This is China have pretty much stuck by this policy ever since the 1980s. For more than 40 years now, and that means China's business is business. It will do business. They will not interfere in your internal domestic policies. They will not interfere with your policy with other countries, that is your business. And for a lot of these countries, it's refreshing because a trade deal with China, welcoming Chinese investment, it comes with no strings attached. And this is quite different from when you're getting a loan from IMF or World Bank, for example, or even say come to the military deal, right? Like when U.S. Sold F-16s to Pakistan, for example, they made Pakistan sign an end user agreement says those F-16 will not be used in a war against India. Right, and China don't do that kind of thing. So whereas U.S. will use trade deal.
Who is Pakistan supposed to use them against? Yeah, who are they supposed to fly? Like they just fly around Pakistan burning fuel? Like what's the point? We need fighter jets we can actually use against India.
Yeah, so I mean, so this is one of the strength of U.S. Chinese foreign policy, but this is also like I know there's also a cause for criticism from some quarters because they feel like China cannot just extricate itself from the world and not get involved. But I also have to remind people, despite China's strength and its size, it still has limitations. For example, China, compared to the United States, it lacks the power projection capability. U.S. have military bases all over the world. China only have one military base, overseas military base in Djibouti, and recently, and it's under heavy surveillance. Recently, Germany just complained that one of its spy plane, when circling around the Chinese frigate around the Red Sea, you've got the Chinese ships supposedly shining a laser on it. The question really should be asked: what is German spy plane doing in the Red Sea? Obviously you are trying to aid the United States into the operation against Yemenis, right? I mean, that's what you're doing. But this is again posed as an example of Chinese aggression because of Chinese space lasers or whatever. And but China do lack projection capabilities. They only have one overseas base in Djibouti, and United States is trying to say, China is building all these ports. They could be dual use. They could be used by military and civilian. But the fact is, Chinese Navy hasn't really, going out all over the world the way United States have. China lacks kind of the logistic support, logistic supply chain, and so China's way of showing support is different, because China relies on its own strength, which is in the area of economy. For example, the Chinese export control on the rare earth. This is people are only starting to realize how important those rare earths are. And because they goes into everything, they goes into cars, they goes into jet engines, they goes into missiles. For example, the reason you need rare earth magnet is because in the car motors, they generate a lot of heat, and the heat demagnetize the magnets. And those rare earth material, they have the property is that they can create heat-resistant magnets. And right now, most of the heat-resistant magnets are produced in China. And so when China finally puts an export control on the rare earth export, there was widespread panic. A lot of the Western car companies think they were going to have to move their operation to China to produce car parts because they can't get access to the rare earth. And as a result of the tariff talk, China agreed to extend 6-month export license for U.S. car makers, but they still haven't lifted the ban of rare earth export for U.S. military industrial complex. For people who are concerned that they might divert rare earth supply from the civilian use from car makers to defense industries, well, defense industry require a whole different grade of rare earth magnets. For the type of the magnets you need for your car is very different from the type of magnets you need for F-35s. And this also created real supply constraint on the side of United States, especially if you observe during the 12-day war between Israel and Iran. Israel were firing off interceptor missiles left and right, and they have to be supplied by United States. All Israel's interceptor missile for David Sling, Iron Dome, they need to their ammunition need to be supplied by United States. And U.S. needs rare earths to manufacturing these missiles. And to give you an idea, the U.S. deployed the THAAD system to Israel to intercept Iranian missiles. And those THAAD batteries, radar plus launcher, each cost $1 billion. And each THAAD interceptor missile costs somewhere between $12 to $13 million a pop. And United States, the whole planned production for that missile interceptor for the whole year of 2025 is 12. Israel just fired off more that missile interceptors in 12 days, more than a whole year's supply from United States. And the planned production in US, that 12 that missile interceptors, that was planned before China put on the rare earth export control. So right now, even if they want to ramp up production, they're gonna have issues to secure those rare earths. And it's not as simple as it's not a simple matter as just dig it out of the earth, because U.S. do have rare earth mines. They have a mine called the Mountain Pass mine in California, right next to Las Vegas. And the problem is U.S. lacks the refining capability to make the rare earth into actual heat-resistant magnet. So currently, all the rare earths they dug out in California, guess what they do with them? They ship to China to proper processing for making into magnets. And U.S., if they want to start domestic production, domestic refining, they're gonna have to import Chinese machine tools. And they somehow have to get their hands on Chinese technology, because U.S. used to lead the world in rare earth production, rare earth refining back in like 1970s. And then in 1980s, they thought, okay, these industry are too polluting. And the Wall Street did their calculation. It's low margin stuff. We don't need this stuff. So they try to offsource this to China, literally offsourcing their pollution. And China at that time was very poor, so they're willing to do the dirty job of mining rare earth. But China tried to climb the technology tree, so immediately they try to start their own refining capabilities. And at that time, U.S. was perfectly okay with that. But people have to remember that was 40 years ago. Those rare earth refining technology have gone through 2 generations of evolution. Currently, most of the IP associated with rare earth refining, it's all Chinese. So US, they will not be able to have a end-to-end supply chain of rare earth inside United States for at least 10 years. First you need to open up a mine, get a new mine up and running, takes about 3 to 4 years under most optimum conditions. And then you need to build the refining capabilities. Assuming they can poach some Chinese engineers and smuggle in some Chinese machine tool, give them at least another six years. And you will take minimum of 10 years to get that set up. And in the meantime, you don't have rare earth. Your supply is running out. What are you going to do?
If you could just tell us briefly where my audience can find you. You have the Silk & Steel podcast, correct? How often do you stream? Do you do it daily?
Well, I'm a prolific shit poster on Twitter, so if you can follow me there, but don't take my posts too seriously. Unless it's true, then do take it seriously. I do have my own YouTube channel. It's under my name, Carl Za. Right now I almost do daily uploads of videos because I'm trying to grow my audience. So follow me there. And I also run a Silk & Steel podcast on my Patreon page. This is where I focus everything on China, but also on history, because that's my real passion. I'm doing a chronological retelling of Chinese history from prehistory. Well, right now I'm up to 341 BC. So I
Wow.
have
Well,
still
you guys have so much history. You guys have been around for a very long time, so I bet it's taken you forever to get here. So how many episodes
yeah.
has it been? Like you put out probably 100 episodes at least.
Like 350 episodes or something like that. Yeah, I already
Wow.
cover a couple thousand years, man.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
I
America,
got-
we only got 200 plus years, so a couple episodes will be done. So,
yeah.
but yeah, that's great. So I'll flash this on the screen for the audience to see.
Trust nothing. No